You are not building wealth. You are reproducing a financial identity that was handed to you. And the two have almost nothing in common. Your income tells a story. But before you assume you wrote that story, consider this. Most people have never examined the relationship between what they earn, how they earn it, and who they believe themselves to be. Those three things feel separate. They are not. This is not about money habits or mindset. It is about something more structural. It is about the identity you carry into every financial decision you make, often without noticing it. Let me describe the pattern clearly. Every person has what I would call a financial identity. Not a budget, not a salary, not a net worth, an identity, a set of deeply held beliefs about what kind of person they are economically, what they deserve, what they are capable of, and what is appropriate for someone like them. This identity is not usually chosen consciously. It is absorbed from family, from community, from early experiences with money that left impressions before you had the language to analyze them. A child watches how their parents speak about money, not just what they say, but how they say it, whether they lower their voice, whether they tighten, whether they treat it as something dangerous, something scarce, something shameful, or something ordinary. That child grows into an adult who reproduces those same emotional relationships with money, usually without ever connecting the behavior back to its origin. The behavior looks like decisions, but it is actually inheritance. Here is the first sharper observation. You did not develop your relationship with money. You received it. And receiving something feels like owning it, which is why so few people ever examine it. Now let us go one layer deeper. The financial identity does not just shape how you earn. It shapes the ceiling you unconsciously maintain. This ceiling is not always visible from the inside. It looks like reasonable caution. It looks like humility. It looks like stability. Sometimes it looks like values. But the ceiling is there. When an opportunity arrives that exceeds what you recognize as appropriate for your category, something inside registers it as a threat rather than an invitation. You may not even be aware of this. The response is so fast and so automatic that it has already shaped your interpretation before your conscious reasoning has started. You begin to find reasons why the opportunity is not right. Too risky, too complicated, not the right time, maybe next year. These are not irrational conclusions. They are structurally accurate conclusions for someone maintaining a particular financial identity. The reasoning is coherent. It just serves a purpose you have not examined. The identity defends itself, not through drama, through logic. And this is where it becomes subtle. The defenses are not lies. They are partial truths deployed selectively. You will find evidence for caution, because evidence for caution is always available. You will find reasons to stay within familiar territory, because familiar territory always offers reasons to stay. The question is not whether the reasons are real. The question is what function they are serving. Now consider the social dimension of this. Financial identity is never purely personal. It is embedded in community, in religious community, in ethnic community, in professional community, in family systems. Every community has implicit economic norms. These are not written anywhere. They are enforced through tone, through subtle approval and disapproval, through what is celebrated and what is quietly criticized. When someone within a community begins to move significantly outside the expected economic range, the community adjusts, not always with hostility, sometimes with warmth, sometimes with concern, sometimes with humor. But the adjustment happens. The community will ask questions, will express worry, will remind you of people who tried something similar and it did not work out, will gently return you to the understood range. And you, because you are a member of that community, because belonging matters to you, because you have internalized its judgments as part of your own judgment, you will often cooperate with this return, without being forced, without even realizing it is happening. Community functions as a regulatory system for economic behavior. This is not malicious, it is structural. All communities do this. The question is whether you have ever observed it operating in your own life. Here is the second sharper observation. Loyalty and limitation often share the same face. When you stay within a financial pattern out of loyalty to your community, it does not feel like limitation. It feels like integrity. Let me now address the identity blind spot that is most difficult to see. Most people believe they want more income, more freedom, more stability, more opportunity. They speak about wanting these things. They may even work toward them. But there is a layer beneath the stated desire where a different preference is operating. That deeper preference is for coherence. Human beings need their circumstances to match their self-concept. This need is powerful and mostly unconscious. When circumstances begin to diverge significantly from self-concept, the discomfort is real. It is not philosophical, it is physiological. So when income begins to increase in ways that outpace the financial identity, the identity generates friction. This friction disguises itself as practical concern, but its actual function is to restore coherence between who you believe you are and what your life reflects. This is why people sabotage. Not because they are self-destructive in any dramatic sense, because the self is coherent and coherence has a cost. This is also why external strategies for wealth building have a limited effect on their own. You can teach someone every correct financial behavior, every relevant principle, every proven method, and they will apply it partially, inconsistently, or until the point where results begin to threaten the identity. Then they will find a reason to stop. The strategy was never the problem. The identity absorbed the strategy and determined how far it would be allowed to work. Now I want to address something specific about how this pattern operates in communities that hold religious or traditional frameworks around money. There is often a tension within these communities between spiritual values and material accumulation. This tension is real and deserves serious consideration, but it also creates a particular vulnerability. The language of spiritual humility can be borrowed to justify economic limitation that has nothing to do with genuine spiritual choice. A person who is afraid to earn more, who feels unconsciously unworthy of greater financial capacity, who has absorbed a fear-based relationship with money, can frame all of that inside the language of piety. And this framing is very difficult to challenge, because it sounds correct, because the values it references are legitimate values, because the community reinforces it. But there is a difference between a person who has examined their relationship with wealth, engaged seriously with what their tradition actually teaches about earning and stewardship, and made a thoughtful choice to live within certain material constraints, and a person who has never examined any of this and is using the language of tradition to avoid examination. Both people may say similar things. The internal structure is entirely different. Here is the third sharper observation. A belief that has never been tested is not a conviction. It is a default. And defaults inherited from fear are not the same as choices made from understanding. We are now at the point where the earlier observations need to be reframed. Everything described so far, the ceiling, the community regulation, the coherence drive, the borrowed spiritual language, these are not character flaws, they are not pathologies, they are structural responses to the financial identity you carry. And here is the reframe that matters. What you have been calling your financial situation is not primarily a financial situation. It is an identity situation wearing financial clothes. The income level is a symptom. The investment behavior is a symptom. The spending patterns are a symptom. The risk tolerance is a symptom. What is generating all of these symptoms is the financial identity, the underlying self-concept operating inside every economic decision. This means that interventions at the level of behavior will always be limited, not useless, limited. Because behavior is downstream of identity, you can change behavior temporarily through effort and discipline, but the identity will keep pulling behavior back toward its own gravity. This is not pessimism. It is structural observation, and the structural observation points toward what actually needs to change, which is not the behavior. It is the understanding of who is doing the behaving. Let me be precise about what I mean. The financial identity is not the self. It is a construction, a learned configuration of beliefs, expectations, emotional responses, and social orientations that was assembled over time, mostly without your conscious participation. Recognizing it as a construction is not the same as dismantling it overnight, but it does change the relationship you have with it. Instead of operating as the identity, which means letting it make every decision invisibly, you begin to observe it. You begin to notice when it is engaging, when the ceiling is activating, when the community regulation is being internalized, when the coherence drive is masking as practical reasoning. This noticing does not require drama. It requires precision. Most people, when they encounter a financial decision, encounter it as themselves, as though their response to that decision is simply who they are, simply what makes sense, simply what anyone in their position would conclude. But the response is not simply who they are. The response is who the identity has trained them to be in that moment. And that distinction between self and financial identity is the only distinction that matters in this conversation. Now consider what changes when that distinction is held clearly. An opportunity arrives. The financial identity begins its assessment. And now, instead of that assessment being the end of the process, it becomes observable. You can watch the ceiling activate. You can watch the familiar objections surface. You can watch the coherence drive begin building its case for staying put. You do not have to agree with it. You can examine the objections not just for whether they are logically coherent, but for what function they are serving. You can ask whether the caution is based on accurate information about the actual situation or on the identity's preference for situations that confirm its boundaries. This examination will not always result in taking the opportunity. Sometimes the caution is legitimate. Sometimes the objection is accurate. Sometimes staying is the right call. But now it is a call, not an automatic response dressed as a rational conclusion. The difference between a choice and an automatic response is not always visible from the outside. From the inside, it changes everything. Let me address one more structural element before the end. There is a relationship between identity and income that runs in both directions. Income shapes identity over time. Sustained increase in income, held long enough for the identity to adjust, will gradually expand what feels normal, what feels appropriate, what feels coherent. This is why some people cross into new financial territory and stay there. The identity catches up. A new normal is established, but the direction matters. The identity must catch up to the new reality. If the income increases but the identity does not adjust, the coherence drive will eventually find ways to return income to familiar territory. Not always through dramatic collapse. sometimes through gradual erosion. Through decisions that seem reasonable in isolation but collectively function to restore the previous level, the income did not fail. The identity reabsorbed it. And this is why wealth that enters faster than identity can process is often temporary. Not because of poor strategy, not because of bad luck, because the self-concept could not hold it. The more durable path is slower in the short term and irreversible in the long term. It requires expanding the financial identity before or alongside expanding the income, not after. It requires the person to genuinely see themselves differently before the bank account reflects that difference, not simply hope the bank account changes first and that the identity follows automatically. Some identities do adjust automatically over time, but adjustment without examination is still adjustment without understanding. And understanding is what creates stability. A person who understands why their financial identity was what it was, who built it, what it was protecting, what it was inheriting, what it was avoiding, that person has a fundamentally different relationship with their new financial reality than a person who simply stumbled into higher income without the understanding. The first person knows what happened and can work with it. The second person is waiting to discover what the identity will do next. Now we arrive at the turn. Everything discussed so far has framed this as a problem to solve, a pattern to recognize and address, an identity to examine and perhaps expand. But consider the possibility that the framing itself reveals something. You came to this conversation assuming that the financial identity was something operating on you, something that needed to be understood so it could be corrected, something that was getting in the way of where you are supposed to be. That assumption contains its own unexamined premise. The premise is that you know where you are supposed to be, that the desired financial destination is clearly right, clearly good, clearly yours, that the resistance is the problem and the aspiration is the truth. But what if the resistance is also carrying information? Not all of it, not purely. The ceiling is not always wisdom, but the identity is not purely obstacle either. It contains values. It contains warnings developed through real experience. It contains the accumulated caution of people who knew things about what happens when resources are accumulated without the right orientation. The examination of a financial identity is not a project of dismantling it so you can earn more money. It is a project of understanding it clearly enough to know what in it was fear, what was conditioning, what was community pressure, and what was actually, upon reflection, sound. That last category deserves as much respect as the others deserve examination. This is the distinction between someone who examines their financial identity and arrives at freedom and someone who examines it and arrives at clarity. Freedom sounds larger, but clarity is more honest. Clarity means you know what you are doing and why. Clarity means the choice is genuinely yours. Clarity means that whether the income expands or stays relatively contained, the relationship with money is no longer unconscious, no longer inherited without examination, no longer defended by borrowed language. The financial identity is not your enemy. It never was. But it is also not your final word on the subject of what is possible or appropriate for you. It is a starting point that most people mistake for an end point. And that mistake, quiet, persistent, and structurally reinforced, is the pattern this entire conversation has been tracking. You are not held back by circumstances. You are held inside an identity. And the identity was always far more yours to examine than it was yours to obey.